Haunted House unveils chilling truth of forgotten victims. The final revelation. Chapter 1. The New Home, Old Secrets. The house stood at the edge of town, a weathered structure with peeling paint and sagging shutters, as if it had been waiting years for someone to breathe life back into it. Emily and Mark pulled into the cracked driveway, their car kicking up loose gravel, and took in the sight of their new home. It wasn't much to look at, hardly a dream house, but during a time when the world had slowed to a crawl and people were confined to their homes, the couple saw it as a chance to escape the monotony of city life and start fresh. The lockdown had strained their relationship in ways they hadn't anticipated. Mark, a freelance writer, found solace in his work, while Emily, who had recently lost her job, struggled with the isolation. The move to a quieter, more secluded place seemed like the perfect opportunity to reconnect and begin again, away from the pressures of daily routines and the constant hum of uncertainty that loomed over the world. As they carried the last of the boxes into the dimly lit hallway, Emily couldn't shake the strange feeling that hung in the air. The house felt different. It wasn't just the age of the building or the odd draft that seemed to follow them from room to room. It was something intangible, a heaviness that seemed to whisper through the faded wallpaper and linger in the dark corners. "Well, it's got character," Mark said, trying to sound upbeat as he dropped a box labeled kitchen onto the dusty floorboards. Emily gave him a weak smile, glancing around at the old fixtures and creaking wood that made the house feel like it had stories to tell. Stories it wasn't quite ready to share. That first night, as they lay in bed exhausted from the move, the silence was almost oppressive. It was a kind of quiet neither of them was used to after years of living in a bustling apartment complex. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to adjust to the stillness. Then, faintly, she heard it, a soft murmur, as if someone were speaking from just beyond the bedroom walls. She strained her ears, listening, but the sound faded before she could make out any words. She brushed it off as a trick of the mind. After all, an old house like this was bound to have its share of noises, pipes groaning, the structure settling, the wind playing tricks with the windows. But in the days that followed, the whispers persisted. Emily began to notice other sounds too. The faint shuffle of footsteps, the quiet creak of a door opening and closing on its own. There were times when she could swear she felt eyes on her. A prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as though someone or something was watching. Mark remained skeptical, chalking it up to Emily's overactive imagination, or perhaps stress from the move. "It's just an old house," he said one evening as they unpacked boxes in the living room. "Old houses make weird noises, that's all." But Emily wasn't convinced. There was a pattern to the disturbances, a rhythm she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was as if the house was trying to communicate, to reach out from the past and make itself known. She started asking questions around town, and that's when she first heard the unsettling nickname, the Quarantine House. An elderly shopkeeper had mentioned it in passing when Emily stopped to buy some cleaning supplies. "You folks are brave, moving into that place," she had said, her voice tinged with something between pity and unease. "Not many would want to live in a house like that, not after what happened." "What do you mean?" Emily had asked, her curiosity piqued. The woman had just shaken her head. "Long time ago, during the old outbreak, but never you mind. Best not to dig up things that are better left buried." That night, Emily shared the encounter with Mark as they sat on the back porch, the night air thick with the scent of damp leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. He listened with mild interest, though his tone remained dismissive. "It's probably just a rumor," he said. "Small towns are full of ghost stories." Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the house's history than idle gossip. A few days later, while exploring the basement, a space cluttered with ancient furniture and cobweb-covered storage chests, they stumbled upon a door at the far end of the room. It was small, inconspicuous, and locked with a heavy rusted padlock. The sight of it filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread and curiosity. "Have you ever seen a door like that in a basement before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark squatted down to examine the lock. "Not really," he admitted, "but it's an old house. People used to keep all sorts of things locked up. Maybe it's just a storage room. The lock was too corroded to pick, and they didn't have the tools on hand to force it open, so they left it for the time being. But as they climbed back up the stairs, Emily couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting the door to swing open on its own. The whispering sounds seemed to grow louder after that, as if they had awakened something by discovering the door's existence. The couple's unease grew with each passing day. It wasn't just the whispers or the feeling of being watched. There was an almost palpable sense of tension in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for some long-buried secret to come to light. And as Emily lay awake night after night, straining to hear the voices that seemed to drift just beyond the edge of consciousness, she couldn't shake the thought that they were far from alone in the old house. Chapter 2: Unveiling the Past. Emily's fascination with the house quickly grew into an all-consuming obsession. The whispers and strange occurrences weren't just figments of her imagination. She was convinced of it. There was a story buried within the walls of their new home, a story that demanded to be uncovered. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft that whispered through the narrow hallways seemed to be urging her to dig deeper. Her days became a blur of old-town records, faded newspaper clippings, and whispered conversations with anyone who could offer a shred of information about the history of the house. It was during one of her trips to the town library, buried in the back pages of a yellowed journal, that she found a grim piece of the puzzle. The house, it seemed, had served as a temporary quarantine facility during a viral outbreak in the 1950s. The epidemic had been swift and brutal, sweeping through the small community like wildfire. The infected were brought to the house, sealed off from the outside world, and left to fight for their lives in isolation. Emily's heart sank as she read accounts of patients being locked in rooms, begging for help, and of nurses who, out of fear, kept their distance, treating the sick through closed doors or leaving trays of food at the threshold. It was clear that many had died there, often alone and in agony. The house had witnessed suffering and despair beyond comprehension, and now those echoes seemed to linger, trapped in the very fabric of the walls. When Emily shared what she discovered with Mark, he remained unconvinced. "It's tragic, sure, but a lot of places have a dark past," he said, his skepticism unyielding. "That doesn't mean there are ghosts here." She wanted to argue, but just as the words formed in her mind, a faint but unmistakable voice broke the silence. It was a low, rasping murmur that seemed to stretch across the distance of time itself, cutting through the stillness of the room. The voice, soft and desperate, called out her name, Emily. Her skin prickled with goosebumps. The sound had been so distinct, so real, that it left no room for doubt. Mark heard it too. She could see it in the way his face went pale, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Okay, that was strange," he admitted, the usual firmness in his voice faltering. Now, sharing a sense of urgency, they decided to delve deeper into the house's history. Emily felt an unshakable connection to the voices, as though they were not merely trying to frighten her, but were reaching out for help, trying to be heard after decades of silence. The next step was to talk to the locals. Someone had to know more than what was written in the public records. Their search led them to a peculiar old woman who lived a few doors down, Mrs. Dolores. Mrs. Dolores was a woman of advanced age, with hair as white as freshly fallen snow and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling awareness. Her house was cluttered with antiques and peculiar trinkets, as if it hadn't changed much since the mid-century. She seemed unsurprised when Emily and Mark arrived on her doorstep, as though she had been expecting them. "I suppose you've come about the quarantine house," she said before either of them had spoken a word, her voice thick with a knowing tone. Emily was taken aback. It was as if Mrs. Dolores could read their thoughts. "Yes," Emily replied, eager for answers. We've been hearing things, and I found some old records about what happened there during the outbreak. Do you know anything else?" Mrs. Dolores' lips curled into a faint smile, though it held little warmth. "I know more than most," she said, her gaze drifting to the window as if looking at something only she could see. "I was just a girl when the sickness came, but I remember the fear, the way everyone avoided that house. People were brought in by the truckload, and few ever came out." Emily leaned forward, sensing there was more to the story. Why weren't they moved to a hospital, she asked. Why use a house? Mrs. Dolores' expression hardened slightly. There was no room left at the hospitals, she replied. The outbreak was worse than people like to remember. They didn't know what else to do, so they turned that house into a last resort. Those who were brought there, it was as good as a death sentence. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside Emily, his skepticism giving way to discomfort. But why keep it a secret, he asked, his voice betraying a hint of unease. Mrs. Dolores' eyes darkened. The town didn't want the shame, she said softly. After it was all over, the house was abandoned, and the memories were buried with it. The encounter left Emily and Mark with more questions than answers, but it also intensified Emily's determination. That night, as they lay in bed, the whispers returned. Louder this time, more insistent. It was as though the voices were beckoning them to uncover what had been hidden for too long. The following day, the couple decided to explore the attic, a dusty, cluttered space filled with relics from another era. As they sifted through the piles of forgotten belongings, Emily discovered a stack of old documents hidden beneath a faded quilt. There were hospital records, listing the names of patients who had been admitted to the makeshift quarantine facility, and personal letters written by those confined to the house. The letters were heart-wrenching, filled with desperate pleas for help, apologies to loved ones, and last goodbyes. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was signed by a young woman named Claire, who had described in detail the pain and fear she had endured. She was trapped here, Emily whispered, her hands trembling as she read the words. They all were. Mark's gaze was fixed on a faded photograph, tucked inside the pages of one of the letters. It showed a group of people standing in front of the house, their faces shadowed by the harsh light of the setting sun. There was a deep sadness in their eyes, as if they already knew what awaited them. As the couple continued to unearth more remnants of the past, the house seemed to respond. The temperature dropped, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over them, broken only by the sound of faint sobs coming from somewhere beyond the attic walls. For the first time, Mark felt a chill of genuine fear. What if we're stirring up something that should have been left alone? He asked, his voice barely audible. But Emily was past the point of turning back. She felt a strange bond with the house, a need to give voice to those who had been silenced. The house had a story to tell, and she was determined to hear it, no matter what it took. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. The air inside the house seemed heavier with each passing day, pressing down on Emily as if the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers had grown louder, more desperate, filling the stillness of the night with a chorus of disembodied voices. But it wasn't only the voices that haunted her now. Her dreams had taken on a disturbing intensity. Night after night, she found herself plunged into vivid nightmares, experiencing the house through the eyes of its former inhabitants. She could see their gaunt faces, hear their cries for help, and feel their despair as they struggled to breathe in rooms that felt like prisons. In one particularly harrowing dream, Emily found herself in a dimly lit hallway, the wallpaper peeling from the walls like dead skin. A pale young woman, her eyes sunken and hollow, lay on a narrow bed at the end of the hall. Her voice was barely a whisper as she murmured, "Please, let me out. I just want to go home." Emily reached out to touch the woman's hand, but the scene dissolved into darkness, leaving her gasping for breath as she woke up. These dreams were not merely fragments of her imagination. Emily was certain they were glimpses into the past, memories left behind by the souls who had once suffered here. There was one voice in particular that stood out from the others, clearer than the rest. It belonged to a young girl, her tone laced with sadness and a sense of urgency. The girl's voice seemed to beckon Emily, drawing her toward the basement door, as though it held the key to understanding everything. The door remained a stubborn mystery, its lock refusing to yield no matter how hard Emily tried. The basement itself was dank and unwelcoming, filled with the musty scent of decay. Though the door was just a few feet away, it felt as though an invisible force kept her from reaching it, as if something on the other side did not want to be disturbed. Still, that small voice, fragile and insistent, would not leave her alone. It repeated the same message over and over in her dreams. You have to help us. Mark noticed the toll the house was taking on Emily, but his explanations remained grounded in the mundane. You've been so focused on the history of this place, it's no wonder you're having nightmares, he said one evening, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. Maybe you should take a break. Clear your head. But Emily could not shake the feeling that something inside the house was reaching out to her, begging her to uncover a truth that had long been buried. The more she listened to Mark's rationalizations, the more it seemed like he was trying to convince himself, not her. It's not just the dreams, she argued. There's something here, something that needs our help. Mark sighed, his skepticism unyielding. Or maybe we're letting a tragic history get to us, he said, his tone softening slightly. You're not alone, Emily. I'm here, and I want to help, but this isn't healthy. Frustrated and feeling increasingly isolated, Emily sought out Mrs. Dolores once more, hoping the elderly neighbor might be willing to share more of what she knew. The old woman greeted her with a wary look, as if sensing the deepening darkness around Emily. They sat in Mrs. Dolores's cluttered living room, surrounded by the weight of decades-old trinkets and forgotten memories. I've been having dreams about the people who died there, Emily said, her voice barely steady. There's a young girl. I think she's trying to tell me something. Mrs. Dolores's expression tightened, and for a moment Emily thought she saw a flicker of fear in the woman's eyes. Dreams can be tricky things, the old woman replied, her tone guarded. They can make you see what isn't there. But you know there's more to this house than just old walls and dust, Emily pressed. You said you remembered the outbreak. Did you lose someone? A heavy silence fell over the room before Mrs. Dolores finally spoke. My sister Claire, she said quietly, her voice trembling. She was only 17 when she got sick. They took her to that house because there was nowhere else to put her. I used to sneak up to the window and call out her name, hoping she'd hear me. Her gaze drifted to a faded photograph on the mantelpiece, and her voice grew distant. But they kept the doors locked tight. No one came out once they went in. Emily's pulse quickened. Did she ever leave the house? Mrs. Dolores shook her head, her eyes growing misty. No, I never saw her again, she whispered, her voice cracking. When the outbreak finally ended, the bodies were taken away. They said she died of the virus, but I always felt there was more to it. I couldn't bear to find out. The weight of the confession hung in the air, filling the space between them. Emily could see the pain in Mrs. Dolores's face, the unhealed wounds that had festered for decades. It was as if the house had trapped not only the spirits of the dead, but also the sorrow of those left behind. Whatever happened there, it's not over, Emily said, her voice trembling with determination. I need to find out the truth. Mrs. Dolores looked at her with a mix of pity and caution. Be careful, dear, she warned. Some doors are meant to stay closed. If you dig too deeply, you might not like what you find. But Emily's mind was made up. That night, she lay awake in bed, her thoughts a jumble of the fragments she had collected. The whispers, the locked basement door, Mrs. Dolores's haunting memories. She couldn't let go of the voice in her dreams, the little girl's plea for help. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the spirits weren't merely restless. They were trapped, bound to the house by the tragedy that had befallen them. As she drifted into a restless sleep, the dreams returned, clearer than ever. This time, Emily found herself in the basement, staring at the locked door. The young girl's voice was stronger now, more desperate. You're so close, please, don't leave us. The door rattled in its frame, as though something on the other side was struggling to be free. Emily woke with a start, her heart racing. She knew she couldn't ignore the call any longer. The secrets buried in the quarantine house had been locked away for too long, and whatever lay beyond that door was waiting for her to set it free. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Victims. The rusted lock gave way with a reluctant creak, and the basement door swung open to reveal a darkness that seemed to breathe. Emily hesitated at the threshold, the air cool and damp against her skin, carrying the musty scent of abandonment. She fumbled for the light switch, but when nothing happened, she resorted to a flashlight, its narrow beam slicing through the shadows to reveal a narrow stairwell leading deeper into the earth. As she descended, each step seemed to echo with the distant cries and whispers she had heard for weeks. The room that unfolded before her was a relic of another time, one that had been deliberately hidden away. Stacks of rusted medical equipment lay scattered amid crumbling walls, their surfaces coated in dust so thick it seemed to muffle the very air. Faded bedding, discarded with the indifference of history, was piled in one corner, stained by age and neglect. A scattering of personal items lay strewn across the floor. A child's shoe, a cracked pair of reading glasses, a faded photograph of a family that had long since moved on. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the cold truth settled in. This was not just an ordinary basement. This had been a makeshift ward, a place where the sick and the dying had been left to endure their final moments. The very walls seemed to bear witness to the pain, the silence thick with unspoken stories that had been buried along with those who had perished here. It was then that Emily noticed a small, leather-bound book resting on a rickety old chair, its cover cracked and faded with time. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she lifted the book. It was a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The name inscribed on the inside cover read, Evelyn Carter, registered nurse. As Emily flipped through the entries, the words seemed to bleed off the page, pulling her into a world that was far removed from the life she knew. Nurse Evelyn had documented the grim reality of the quarantine with a meticulousness that spoke of both duty and despair. There were accounts of patients abandoned by their families, of bodies piled in rooms when the hospital staff had grown too ill or too frightened to carry them away. Each entry told a story of human suffering magnified by isolation and indifference, and the tone grew more desperate with each passing day. August 4th, 1953. The patients keep arriving, but there is no more room. We are out of supplies, and I fear that help is not coming. The mayor visited yesterday, but did not stay long. He looked afraid. No one wants to admit it, but we are on our own now. August 11th, 1953. Several patients have died in the last 24 hours. There is no time for proper burials. We have started using the basement as a temporary holding area. The stench is unbearable, and the cries of those still living fill the night. I try to comfort them, but what can I say? August 17th, 1953, the basement door was locked today by order of the town council. They said it was for the safety of the healthy, but all I can think about is the look in the eyes of the people we left behind. I have failed them. The entries grew increasingly fragmented, Evelyn's handwriting more erratic, as if penned by a hand weakened by exhaustion and despair. Emily's grip tightened on the journal as the final pages recounted a day that Evelyn seemed to have dreaded for weeks. August 23rd, 1953. They sealed the basement. We were told to leave those who could not be saved. I have never heard screams like that. I see their faces every time I close my eyes. God forgive us. Emily's hands trembled as she closed the journal, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what she had uncovered. These were not just stories from a time long past. They were cries for justice, for recognition. The people who had died here had been more than mere victims of a virus. They had been forsaken, discarded like refuse by a community that had abandoned its most vulnerable in their hour of greatest need. She barely heard Mark as he called down the stairs, his voice tinged with anxiety. Emily, are you down there? What are you doing? Mark's footfalls thudded against the creaky steps as he descended, his eyes widening as the beam of his flashlight swept over the room and its grim contents. What is all this? He breathed, his voice hollow. It's the truth, Emily whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. They left people down here to die. Mark's face paled, his skepticism beginning to erode in the presence of such undeniable evidence. That's horrible, he stammered. But it's history, Emily. We can't change what happened back then. Emily shook her head, her eyes dark with determination. It's not just history, Mark. This house, it's still carrying the weight of what happened here. Those people didn't just die, they were abandoned. It's no wonder their spirits can't rest. A sudden chill swept through the room, causing both of them to shiver despite the stagnant air. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the distant whispers that Emily had grown so accustomed to seemed to surge into a low, mournful wail. The floorboards creaked as if under the weight of many unseen feet, and for a brief moment, Emily thought she saw a shadow move out of the corner of her eye. "Emily, we need to get out of here," Mark urged, his voice unsteady as he reached for her arm. "This place isn't safe." But Emily resisted, her gaze fixed on the journal and the room around her. "We can't leave them," she insisted. "Not again." The following days brought a surge in supernatural disturbances throughout the house. Doors opened and closed on their own, the once faint whispers now escalating into full sentences, as though the spirits had found a voice. Objects moved inexplicably, and a palpable energy seemed to permeate the air. Emily could no longer dismiss the fleeting images she saw at the edge of her vision. Figures in old-fashioned clothing, their faces drawn and expressionless. The tension between her and Mark reached a boiling point. He was increasingly unnerved by the manifestations, his rational mind struggling to cope with the inexplicable events that defied all logic. "This is too much, Emily," he said one night, after a particularly unsettling incident where the lights had flickered for nearly an hour. "We need to leave this place before it gets worse." "I can't just walk away," she replied, her voice firm. "Don't you understand? If we leave, it's like we're saying what happened here doesn't matter, that those people didn't matter." Mark's expression softened, his frustration giving way to a pained understanding. "But what if staying only puts us in danger? What if whatever's in this house doesn't want to be helped?" Emily glanced at the journal, lying open on the coffee table, Evelyn's words echoing in her mind. She knew Mark had a point, but she could not shake the feeling that something unfinished awaited them in the darkness of that basement. There was more to uncover, truths that had been hidden not just by walls and locks, but by time itself, and she was determined to bring them to light, no matter the cost. Chapter 5: Confronting the Authorities. Emily and Mark's quest for truth took on a life of its own, growing more urgent with each passing day. Armed with Evelyn's journal and a relentless drive to expose the injustices hidden in the bowels of their new home, they decided to seek out anyone who could provide further insights. Their search led them to Mr. Wallace, an elderly man now living a quiet life on the outskirts of town. He had once been a nurse at the makeshift quarantine facility, and Emily hoped he would have answers. They found him at a modest cottage shrouded by trees, the weathered siding and overgrown garden a testament to years of neglect. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance before Mark knocked on the door. It opened slowly, revealing a frail man with wispy white hair and deep lines etched into his face, his blue eyes dulled by time. Mr. Wallace stared at them with a wary expression. "We need to talk to you about the quarantine house," Emily said, her voice steady but urgent. "You were there, weren't you? You know what really happened?" For a moment, the old man's gaze turned distant, as though he were lost in a memory he had tried to bury long ago. He hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the door tightly. "Why do you want to dig up the past?" he asked, his tone both guarded and weary. "Because the people who died there deserve justice," Mark interjected, his eyes narrowing. "And because no one seems to be telling the whole truth. We found a journal, a nurse named Evelyn's. She documented everything. We know the basement was sealed and the patients were left behind." The mention of Evelyn's name seemed to pierce through Mr. Wallace's defenses. His face twitched, and he sighed heavily, stepping back to let them inside. The interior of his home was cluttered and dimly lit, filled with faded photographs and dusty furniture. He gestured for them to sit at a small kitchen table, where he took a seat across from them, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. "Evelyn was a good nurse," he began slowly. "She cared deeply for the patients. I tried to do what I could, but there were orders we had to follow. The council didn't want the truth to get out. They were afraid it would ruin the town's reputation if people found out how many died, and under such terrible circumstances. We were told to lock the basement and forget, as if it could all be erased." Emily's jaw tightened, her grip on the edge of her chair turning her knuckles white. "You're saying the deaths were covered up to protect the town's image?" she pressed, her voice rising. Mr. Wallace nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to the table. "Yes, they didn't even keep proper records of who died or where they were buried. It was all swept under the rug. The town moved on, but that house, it didn't." As he spoke, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening in the corners. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance, sensing an unseen presence. It was as though the very walls were listening, resonating with a history that refused to be silenced. "Why didn't you say anything?" Mark asked, his tone edged with frustration. "You knew what was happening, and you kept quiet." Mr. Wallace's expression hardened, his eyes clouded with a mixture of shame and defiance. "I was just one man," he replied, his voice cracking. "What could I have done? The council, they had power, connections. They made sure no one talked." A sudden crash interrupted the conversation, making Emily and Mark jump. The old man's coffee cup had shattered on the kitchen floor, even though no one had touched it. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if it were pressing down on them. Emily's skin prickled, and she was acutely aware of a faint, distant whisper, almost like a warning. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Wallace's face paled. "You need to leave," he said abruptly, his tone urgent. "If you keep pushing, things will only get worse. There are forces at play here that go beyond what you think you know." But Emily wasn't willing to back down. "The spirits aren't just restless," she said. "They're trying to warn us. There's something else, something more dangerous than just a cover-up." Mark frowned, looking at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Emily, are you sure this isn't... I mean, what if we're just imagining all this? What if the stress is getting to us?" Before Emily could respond, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, rattling the windows and extinguishing the light bulb overhead. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the three people seated at the table. Then, in the silence, a low voice echoed, a voice that did not belong to any of them. "Leave or suffer the same fate." Mark grabbed Emily's arm. "We need to go, now." They stumbled out of the house, hearts pounding as they reached the car. Emily's hands shook as she started the engine, her mind racing. She was certain now that they were not alone in their pursuit of the truth. Whatever forces were tied to the house were growing more desperate, more violent, as if trying to keep its secrets buried forever. Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. Lights flickered wildly, objects flew off shelves, and strange accidents began to occur. A tree branch nearly crashed through their bedroom window one night, barely missing Emily as she stood by the dresser. The following morning, Mark's car wouldn't start, though it had been working fine the day before. The electrical system seemed to short-circuit whenever Emily tried to send messages to local news outlets about what they had uncovered. Despite the mounting danger, Emily refused to be deterred. She pored over every clue they had gathered so far, piecing together fragments of information and testimonies from elderly townsfolk who could remember those dark days. Each step she took seemed to unravel yet another layer of deceit, but it also brought her closer to an awareness she hadn't fully grasped before, that the spirits were not the only supernatural entities haunting their lives. One night, as she lay in bed, a vivid nightmare gripped her. She was back in the basement, but the room was alive with activity. Patients lay on makeshift cots, their faces twisted in agony, while shadowy figures moved amongst them, whispering words that chilled her soul. One of the figures turned toward her, its face obscured, but its eyes seemed to burn through the darkness. It wasn't just the sickness that killed them, it said in a voice that was not entirely human. Emily awoke, drenched in sweat, her pulse racing. She could feel it now, a presence within the house that went beyond the spirits of the forgotten victims. It was something darker, more malicious. A malevolent force that had taken root during those desperate days of quarantine and had not relinquished its grip. She had to confront it, whatever it was, and she had to do it soon. Otherwise, the truth would remain buried, and the spirits would never find peace. But as she prepared to take the next step in her investigation, a gnawing fear lingered in the back of her mind. Was she putting herself and Mark in the path of something that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets? Chapter 6, The Final Revelation. The pieces of the puzzle were almost complete, yet Emily felt the final answer was just beyond her grasp. The more she dug, the darker the truth seemed to become. Late one evening, as she scoured through Old Town records and documents, she stumbled upon a hidden file buried deep within the archives. It was a faded government report marked classified, its yellowed pages crackling with age. Emily's fingers trembled as she pulled it from the dusty pile, the weight of its secrets pressing down on her even before she had read a single word. The report detailed a grim decision made in the town's highest circles, one driven by fear and a ruthless desire to protect the affluent neighborhoods from the spreading contagion. The authorities had knowingly diverted the sick to the quarantine house, placing them there to prevent the outbreak from infiltrating the wealthier areas. They had effectively condemned the patients to die in isolation, their cries for help unheard, their suffering ignored. Emily felt a sickening chill crawl up her spine. This was the final, undeniable proof of the town's betrayal. It explained the anger of the spirits, their desperate need for justice. She sat in silence, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The house had been more than just a quarantine station. It had been a dumping ground for human lives deemed expendable. She knew that revealing this truth would stir outrage, but she also sensed a darker consequence behind it. The restless spirits were not the only ones who had been awakened by the uncovering of these secrets. As if on cue, a sharp, icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lamp on her desk. Emily's breath misted in the sudden cold. She could hear it then, a low, mournful wail that seemed to reverberate through the walls, as though the house itself was lamenting its past. Mark found her huddled over the documents, her face pale and her eyes wide. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice low, as though he feared disturbing whatever darkness now hovered over them. "They sent the sick here on purpose," Emily replied, her voice barely audible. "They sacrificed them to keep the rest of the town safe. And now, I think that anger, that pain, it's become something else, something darker." Mark's face tightened, a mixture of guilt and apprehension flashing in his eyes. For a moment, he hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to speak. Finally, he sighed and looked away. "Emily, there's something you need to know," he began, his voice strained. "When I first started researching the house, I came across rumors about the quarantine. I didn't think they were true. Or at least, I hoped they weren't. I didn't want to tell you. I thought it would just scare you." Emily turned to him, a mix of disbelief and anger flaring in her gaze. "You knew?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You knew people died here, like this, and you didn't say anything? I didn't know it was this bad." Mark protested, his voice rising in desperation. "I didn't know they were sent here deliberately to die. I thought it was just another tragic quarantine story. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" Emily echoed, her tone edged with bitterness. "Or protect yourself from facing the truth?" The air grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to deepen, their dark tendrils inching toward them like grasping fingers. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as a suffocating pressure descended over the room, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the very walls were alive, pulsating with the despair of those who had perished within them. The house itself groaned, the sound echoing through the corridors. A low, rumbling voice seemed to seep out of the darkness, carrying with it a malevolence that felt ancient and insatiable. "You cannot escape," it whispered, the words laced with a deep-seated rage. "We are many, and we demand retribution." Suddenly, the shadows coalesced in the center of the room, forming a shape that writhed and shifted as if composed of smoke and ash. It loomed over Emily and Mark, its eyes glowing with a sickly, otherworldly light. This was not merely the spirits of the forgotten victims. It was a manifestation of their collective agony, a dark entity born from their unending suffering and neglect. Emily's instincts screamed at her to flee, but she stood her ground. "We know what happened here," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We'll make sure the world knows too. You'll have justice." The entity's form shuddered as if mocking her words. "Justice," it snarled. "There is no justice for the dead, only suffering." The figure lunged forward, its shadowy arms stretching toward them like claws. Emily felt a freezing numbness seeping into her bones, an oppressive force that threatened to crush her spirit. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her back as the temperature plummeted even further. "Emily, we need to find a way to stop it," he shouted, his breath coming out in visible puffs. Emily's gaze fell upon Evelyn's journal, lying open on the desk. She remembered the final entry. Evelyn had written about an old ritual she had heard of from a patient, one that might bring peace to troubled spirits. It required acknowledging the spirit's suffering and offering them a token of closure. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She reached for the journal and began to recite the words aloud, her voice growing stronger with each line. To those who suffered unjustly, to those whose lives were taken, hear me now. We acknowledge your pain, your loss. We offer this truth as a light to guide you to peace. The entity screeched, a sound like tearing metal and broken glass. Its form wavered, flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. Emily continued, her voice rising over the din. Your story will not be forgotten. You will not be buried in silence. We will be your voice. The shadows seemed to recoil, retreating toward the walls, where they twisted and writhed as if in agony. The room began to warm, the oppressive darkness lifting ever so slightly. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity dissolved into a wisp of smoke, vanishing into the ether with a final, anguished cry. Emily and Mark collapsed onto the floor, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The house felt different. Lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. But there was still a lingering chill, a faint echo of the malevolent force that had plagued them. As Emily picked herself up, she noticed a subtle glow in the corner of the room. A small figure, barely visible, standing there. It was Evelyn, or what was left of her spirit. She gave Emily a soft, sorrowful smile before fading into the air, her form dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Days later, Emily published the full story, including the documents and journal entries that detailed the town's shameful past. Her article spread quickly, sparking outrage and a long overdue reckoning. The victims were finally acknowledged, and their voices, once silenced, were now heard across the community. Yet, as she and Mark prepared to leave the house, Emily couldn't shake a final, unsettling feeling. As she stood on the threshold, she glanced back one last time. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow flicker at the edge of the basement stairs, a reminder that some things never truly leave. The house was quieter now, but not entirely at peace.